You know, Amy's been thanking people every night. We haven't really given her or Gabe a thanks, so let's do that. And I would like to thank you for coming. We academics spend our time usually talking to one another. We usually get our promotions and our tenure by talking to fellow academics, writing for fellow academics. And usually someplace along the line, we come to the conclusion that they may buy our books or they may not, and that if we really want our ideas to spread, we better talk to general audiences. My tests for general audiences are my librarian wife and my librarian daughter. And if they don't make it past the first page or two, I'm still not with the general audience. Thank you for coming, because you are a part of lifetime learners. And I don't think there's anything better than that. This last week, I was up in the central part of Washington, Moses Lake, Washington, celebrating my 60th high school reunion. And they asked us to sum it all up in 2 words. And when it got around to me, I said, I think we ought to think more. And I think what you're doing tonight is thinking more. And if Jane and I do the job that we want to do, we'll help you with that. Now, when people look at history, they quite often look at history vertically. So that in this series, in a sense, we have looked at Oregon history vertically from the beginnings up to now. We should continue to do that. But there is another way to look at history, and that's horizontally. And I think we ought not to ever forget that, and that's what Jane and I are going to attempt to do tonight. We're going to try to help you think about how history is horizontal. And we're going to try to help you to do that with the idea of cross-continental history, so that I'll lap out from Oregon to the nation, and Jane will lap out from the Washington, D.C. or outside Oregon back to Oregon. Because if we keep both of those, the vertical and the horizontal, going at the same time, I think it gives us a more complex kind of history. And that's exactly what we want to accomplish. I have the presentation that I want to use with 4 writers, 4 Oregonians, 2 of them writers and 2 of them politicians. And I'd like you to think, as I present with these 4 people, what 4 or more you might use if you were going to pick 4 people that are Oregonians or who've spent a good deal of their life in Oregon and have had national influence. I'm not prefacing this with the idea these are the 4 most important, but they are 4 important figures. And we start out with a writer-historian, Francis Fuller Victor. We then go on to William S. Su Rin, a political activist and theorist. Then we talk about another writer, H.L. Davis, a novelist. And then I end with Mark Hatfield. And think of some others. You know, the committee has been wrestling with those 2 people back in Statuary Hall. Should they be Dr. McLaughlin and Jason Lee, or should they be other people? So I think about some of you talking about Abigail Scott Duniway, who's an awfully good figure, Chief Joseph, Governor Tom McCall. And then I'm reminded of that little boy recently who said the 3 things that were awfully important in his life were Jesus, girls, and Marcus Mariota. Well, I'm not sure which one of those he was putting at the top and which one he was putting third, but it's intriguing to me that in the last 6 months, Marcus Mariota has gotten more headlines in this state than any other place. Well, I'm also interested in biographical history. I believe that historiographical trends come and go, but biography endures forever. And so I think we ought to talk about people, and so I intend to do that. First, Francis Fuller Victor. Francis Fuller Victor, historian. She was born in New York, and she and her sister became writers. They were writers who wrote anything that would pay. So that quite often they first wrote what we would call subliterature. They both wrote dime novels. And they were interested in making writing a profession. And so they ran into the dilemma that all of us do, and we who've been academics, we've always been told, don't ever give up your day job if you want to be a writer. And of course, it is difficult to make your living as a writer, and the dilemmas she experienced illustrate that. Well, she first married and moved to the Midwest and tried homesteading, and that marriage soon broke up. She was a very assertive person, and her relationships with both two husbands and with her female friends quite often would break on the assertiveness. On the other hand, it was part of that assertiveness, I think, that made her a very good historian. She was willing to take positions and to research them and to give us conclusions rather than just tell a story. She married that. She was a narrative historian who was willing to make conclusions. She came after 2 years in California to Oregon in 1864, and second marriage didn't work out, and she began to think about how she could make a living as a writer here in Oregon. And she was something of a historical tourist. She spent an awful lot of time traveling and looking at places and seeing if she could find stories in there that would lead to historical writing. And in 1870, she wrote her first book about Oregon entitled River of the West, and it was a life and times of Joe Meek, the Merry Mountain Man. And I think she was taken a little bit with Joe Meek. There was no, I think, question that he flirted with her a bit, but she also put him in the times of 19th century Oregon. And so she did a job that, in fact, created a lot of controversy, positive reactions about how she had treated Meek, negative reactions on the criticism of missionaries. 2 years later, she wrote a book that was even more historical tourism all over Oregon and Washington. And she had traveled much more than any historical writer during that period of time. And she had been to the interior part, Pacific Northwest, up and down Oregon and Washington, the central part. So she really knew the places that she was writing about, and it became a good seller. She wanted to see the region, and not only see it as a historian, but also to see it in actual eyes so that what she was writing about people would see. So what you saw in Frances Fuller Victor then was a person who was good and strong on research. She was an exceptional storyteller. She was a person with strong opinions, and these are not the same opinions I think that you would have in 2015. For example, she treated Indians as savages. I can remember my own historical work until about the 1950s. Most of our textbooks did have the word savage. So in using that word, she was not out of place for her time, but she was a person who talked a great deal about Indians as savages. She was negative about the Lee mission. That didn't make things very popular for her. And she was drawn to the masculine, romantic Meek, and she loved biography. But she couldn't make a living. And so in 1878, she went to work for H.H. Bancroft. H.H. Bancroft was a businessman who became a historian in the San Francisco area, and maybe he remained more businessman than historian, but he published 39 fat volumes of a history from Mexico up through Alaska. And she was involved in that. It was grueling work. And Bancroft himself would stand as I'm standing 11 and 12 hours a day writing and editing, and he expected the same of his writers. Frances Fuller Victor was paid $100 a week for her work, which was okay, but she wasn't very good at saving because she kept going on those trips to see new historical research. She signed a contract that she would not have her name on the page as the author, that Mr. Bancroft would, and he didn't even promise that she would get a great deal of credit. Well, after 10 or 11 years of that, she decided she'd had enough of that and came back to Oregon. And it's intriguing that about 2 years, 3 years after she left Bancroft, there were a couple of book exhibits here on the Pacific Coast and one in the famous 1893 Chicago, and she pasted over his name, Frances Fuller Victor. So she got the victory on that, I guess. if you still wanted to go to something that was as thorough as anything that was written before the 1930s, these two fat volumes of about 800 pages each. And she had interviewed the Applegates, she had talked to Matthew Deedy, she had done what we later call oral history. They're fat, thorough, footnoted volumes. And they're still very, very good volumes for sources, because they were written before we had historical societies with a lot of documents. So she had done the research. Well, finally she had enough and came back. And her life was very, very difficult in the last 10 years. It showed the difficulty for women to make a living for themselves in this time period, 1850 to about 1900, if they were not a sister, daughter, or wife. And it was very, very difficult for her to make a living. She did a lot of begging. The Oregon Historical Quarterly was just beginning, and she would opportune the editor to pay her for her essays. He didn't particularly want to do that. That's still a dilemma for us who write for historical journals. Who were the heroes and heroines of her books? Dr. McLaughlin, the Applegates, and Matthew Deedy. Who were the rascals or the less than heroic? Indians as savages. Indians should be pushed aside. Missionaries were misguided, especially Joseph Lane was a rascal because he had not supported Dr. McLaughlin. And she was a little bit less negative in when she talked about the black robes. Religion was not particularly a part of her feelings, and it showed up in her books. So, national influences, well, you would still go to her for the 19th century, and I think maybe Oregon editor Harvey Scott got it right. Oregon has but one historian, Francis Fuller Victor, he said at the last part of the 19th century. So, the source on the Pacific Northwest for that period. All right, second person, William S. Su Rin. He was a nationally recognized figure in the 1890 to 1920 period. He was a reformer, a political reformer, whose ideas became widespread. He was an idea man who helped push the Oregon legislature to put through what we call the Oregon system, which I'll talk about in a moment. This is part of what we call the progressive movement, the 1890s to about 1920. And probably he was the most best known and influential Oregonian political thinker before maybe the later contingent of Wayne Morris and Mark Hatfield and Robert Packwood and Tom McCall. He was born in New York to Cornish immigrants who were both Christian and socialists, and kind of shaky in both of those, not very orthodox in either of those areas. He left home at age 17. His father had been a blacksmith. He had learned that. He went to Colorado. He blacksmithed for a while. He was a miner and went to law school. And had a difficult time with either TB or something like that. Was told if he didn't get to dry climate, he would have difficulty. He went to Hawaii for a while and then retreated to California and came here to Oregon in about 1889. Worked on a farm first and then came to this area in Milwaukee and in Oregon City. And he became active in Republican politics and then in the Populist Party. And he had read someplace that he ought, in fact, never to be president of an organization, only be a secretary. You could accomplish more by being behind the scenes, but manipulating behind the scenes. And only on one or two occasions did he really try to put himself forward as an office holder. He was much more a person likely to give ideas. Someplace along the line, he fell in love with what's called the single tax. Single tax, we don't talk much about it now, and I think his influence probably came from reading Henry George's book, Progress and Poverty, in the 1880s. And George believed the real ruin of the United States. And remember now, this is right in the middle of what historians call the robber baron movement, when the Rockefellers and the Carnegies are coming in and the Vanderbilts sort of taking over. And the Republican Party is quite different in those years than in the Lincoln period or in the Teddy Roosevelt period. And George said that what we really need to do is we need to issue a tax on people who are getting land, and they can hold on to the land until it escalates in value. And by doing that, they aren't doing anything. They aren't working the land. They aren't actually doing any work with the land. They're just getting money from its escalating value. So he said you ought to have a strong single tax on that. It would keep those people from going high up on the financial echelon, and it would bring up other people who were poor. When he came to Oregon and began to spread his ideas, he said, I want to use any means possible to get through the single tax idea. Here's the conclusion. He never got through the single tax idea, but he got through the tools that he wanted to use. And you know most of them. We think of the initiative, in which if you think the legislature is not moving in your direction, you initiate legislation with petitions. If you think the legislature has gotten off track, you try, in fact, through referendum to bring it back to the people. And if you think that the legislators themselves have gotten off track, you try to recall them. Well, along with that, also, he began to talk about the direct election of senators. I always had to tell my students that in the 19th century, you did not elect senators. The state legislature did. And it wasn't until the early part of the 20th century that the state legislature did. Well, that was part of Urin's Oregon system, too. And he also wanted more open primaries. Well, that's all together: initiative, referendum, recall, direct election of senators, and open primaries. We give it a title. We call it the Oregon system. It was very influential across the country. And in fact, in 1897, when he did get elected to the state legislature, he held up the legislature, kept it from meeting, because he and the Republicans and the populists stayed away. And so that the legislature couldn't pass legislation that they wanted to do supportive of big business or of rascal political bosses. And we know that he had influence not only here in Oregon, but he had influence nationally. Woodrow Wilson made a trip when he was governor of New Jersey, getting ready to run for president of the United States. And he said, I'm considered intensely progressive in my state. When I get here and think about and hear about Mr. Urin, I'm not sure. And Harvey Scott said it a little bit better. He said there are two legislatures in Oregon, one in Salem and one under Mr. Urin's hat. Or another person put it this way: there are four arms of the Oregon government. There's a governor, there's a legislature, there's a judiciary, and there's Mr. Urin, and it's still up in the air as to which one is the most important. Well, he had that national influence. The progressive period wanted to deliver politics back to the people, and so they wanted, in fact, to advocate for what he was talking about. He called it direct democracy. So Urin had a national influence. Ironically, in 1914, he runs for governor. He runs badly and retires from politics. And what it really proved, I think, is that he was much better as an idea man than he was a person holding office. So power to the people and national progressivism were the national influences that Urin illustrated. All right. Unfortunately, this shadowy character is H.L. Davis, and a novelist. Story. Recently, I went down to the Oakland Library, not the Oakland, California Library, but the Oakland, Oregon Library, north of Roseburg. And I went into the library and I said, do you have any information on H.L. Davis? H.L. Davis who? Well, H.L. Davis was born in that area. He is the only Oregon writer to win the Pulitzer Prize. And so for you younger generation, for you folks who are not literary people, and for those Oakland librarians, they need to know more about H.L. Davis. Born here in Oregon and lived here for the first part of his life. His father was a one-legged school teacher who traveled around a lot. And I'm looking at a historian who knows a lot about this because he's written about this place where the Davis family moved. They moved to Antelope, Oregon, where the Rajneesh would come, and that historian would write about that. And now it's a place where an evangelical organization owns the place. Well, the Davis family was picaresque. They wandered a lot. And so you got those in his stories. In 1928, he and James Stephens was another writer. You know him as an author of a lot of the Paul Bunyan stories. They met late at night, not clear which town they were in. Some said Eugene, some said the Dalles, which had become the home of the Davises. And they wrote about a 20-page pamphlet called Status Rerum. And I think maybe they had been fueled by a lot of alcohol. And they attacked the professors who were writing and also teaching writing at the University of Washington and the University of Oregon, and their students. And in some ways, they were grassroots guys. They never went to college, so they were attacking those people sort of on the other spectrum. And so you get in this pamphlet, high dudgeon and low humor. These scribblers, Stephens and Davis wrote, are nothing but posers, parasites, and pismires. Now, if you don't know what pismires means, loosely translated, pissants. And they went on to say, the trouble with these writers, they don't even know how to castrate calves. Well, this did not endure Davis to a lot of people in the state. He left soon thereafter, but he had begun to write as a poet. He had won a major prize from Poetry Magazine. And then he said, my job is to try to make a distinction between tradition and illusion. Tradition, he said, was like truth or history. Illusion is what people bring into the state. So he tells this story about his hard-shell Baptist preacher grandfather. And he says it's the truth. You tell me whether you think so. It happened according to family tradition one night after a wedding in the hotel at which he, the grandfather, had been invited to officiate. After the ceremony, he withdrew to an upstairs room and went to bed, leaving the guests to their dancing and celebrating, which usually lasted till daylight. Along past midnight, he was roused by some disturbance in the horse corral that sounded as if prowlers might be sneaking up to spring the gate and stampede the horses. Raising an alarm seemed a waste of time in such an emergency, so he rummaged an old muzzle-loading shotgun out of a closet, rammed down a double load of powder and shot, leaned out the window, and let go both barrels at the shadows outside the corral gate. Nobody ever found out whether he hit anything or not, because loading the gun hurriedly in the dark, he had rammed the tail of his nightshirt down one barrel, along with the powder, and the shot yanked him out and the window head first. He fell 3 floors into the middle of the wedding celebration, with his shirt tail in flames around his neck, and scared everybody almost to death. Several guests collapsed, and some ran 8 or 10 miles without stopping. My grandfather sustained a broken arm and second-degree burns, and miscarriages were claimed by 2 ladies and denied heatedly by 3 others, including the bride. Honey and the Horn, his major novel, was full of stories like that. Thankfully, Oregon State is putting out a new edition of it. I think the guy's name whose name doesn't show up is Etulain, so I wrote the introduction. It'll be out in about a month, and you'll have an opportunity to read it. It's a picaresque novel. It's a kind of Oregon Huckleberry Finn, and a young orphan guy who's in his late teens wanders from the Willamette out to the coast and finally back over to the Antelope country. And in doing that, he finds a love, and they try to become a couple. She has a miscarriage, and it sort of breaks them up for a while. But in the final scenes, they seem to have joined a group and maybe are moving toward a kind of maturity and a settling down. The book is full of how character types and their landscapes are interrelated. We use the word regionalism for the kind of literary treatment that shows you how landscapes, how terrains, how environments can shape character. And what he was trying to suggest in Honey and the Horn, as in most of his novels, he wrote about 5 novels and short stories, is how the terrain, how the culture shaped people here in Oregon. So what we see in H.L. Davis is regionalism writ large. There was a review by one of his friends, H.L. Mencken. It's wonderful to get your review in the front page of a New York newspaper saying it's the best first novel ever written by an American. That ought to be worth 5,000 to 10,000 copies of sales. Well, he captured the sweep of readers in the 30s and 40s, won praise from people like Carl Sandburg and Robinson Jeffers and later Wallace Stegner. So I would say to you it's the best novel in the Oregon country before the 1960s. Fourth character, Mark Hatfield. Ask this question. Has any Oregon politician had more influence and impact than Mark Hatfield? He's been a long-time political Oregon leader and then a national one. Was he a statesman? And should he be considered one? Well, he spent a lifetime in politics, teaching and leading too. And by the way, he's the only lifetime Oregonian of these four that I'm talking about. He was born in his family in evangelical Baptist backgrounds. He was born in Salem, went to Willamette, life-changing experience in World War II, MA from Stanford, political science, teaching political science as Dean of Students at Willamette. And then look at the dates here. 1950, elected to the Oregon House. So if you put the dates together, he's 28. 4 years later, Oregon Senate. 2 years later, Oregon Secretary of State. 2 more years, governor, and 4 more years, Oregon governor, and then 4 more years, U.S. Senate, where he serves for 30 years. Retired in 1997, and his death in 2011. Well, let's go back, and if you look at the sort of the backgrounds here, look how he comes on scene. In 1964, so he's still governor, he's the keynote speaker for the Republicans. Quite often what the political parties do is bring people that are up and coming for their keynote or introducing people. And do you realize that in 1968, when Nixon was looking for a vice president, Mark Hatfield was one of those, a group of about 4 or 5, that was seriously considered for vice president, instead of that rascal from Maryland, Mr. Agnew. And if that had happened, Mark Hatfield in 1973 would have been president of the United States. So that's a very interesting possibility. Early on, you see Hatfield making choices. And by the way, he's a Rockefeller Republican, so he would be quite distant from Tea Party Republicans in our time. And he had gone to Hiroshima, just months after the atomic bomb. And that had a very negative impact on him when he saw what had occurred there. And so early on, he becomes a very anti-war in his statements, but pro-soldier. And it reminded me a little bit, if you know your history, of Abraham Lincoln in 1848, when he was very anti-Mexican war, but very pro-soldier. Middle of the road positions, he called himself a moderate. Other people referred to him as a progressive liberal Republican. There's a documentary that came out just in the last months called Gentlemen in the Senate. And that documentary film also talks about other positions, that he was an environmentalist, but he was also very supportive of the lumber industry, and that he was for individualism, but he also found ways to get government support for programs. He was not close to either Wayne Morse or McCall. If you remember correctly, he ran against both of them. They ran against him, I should say. But he was very pro-civil rights. He was anti-Vietnam War. He was critical of Nixon, but in a moment I'll just say one other thing. And he could work very closely with Democrats. If you remember, he worked very closely with his neighbor, Frank Church, on anti-Vietnam legislation. He also worked with George McGovern and Harold Hughes, both Democrats, on anti-Vietnam. And he even thought of resigning so Republicans could win a budget issue. There's been divided opinion on Hatfield. Jimmy Carter, quote, "Mark Hatfield was a kind of hero of mine. I was filled with admiration for him." Now in the diary of Ronald Reagan from the same party. After Hatfield, as chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, rejected one of Reagan's budget proposals for dramatically raising budgets for the military, he voted against it and helped defeat it for a while. Reagan recorded in his diary, which has just been published recently, "With friends like this, do we need enemies?" So that's his own party in a person saying that. Well, there's certainly a national influence of Mark Hatfield, and I'll quote in just a moment something. Is Mark Hatfield a Lincoln of Oregon? Perhaps, if so, infusing of his politics and morality and his willingness to work with others. It is a kind of moral political legacy. It's pro-life, which got him into trouble with some of his liberal colleagues. He was anti-capital punishment, which got him into problems with some of his conservative colleagues. He would compromise, but he wouldn't be compromised. I think you can understand the difference of those. Stand alone or come home, he said. Consistency. He took on moral issues, though they threatened his elections. Abortion, anti-war, lessened military budgets. Is it right? A revealing story. When Hatfield went to see Nixon after the president's fall and others were not going, an observer asked Hatfield why had he done that. Because I love him, said Hatfield. One final story that just has appeared in Books and Culture. This is a joint book review by Mark Noll, who's probably the leading evangelical historian in the United States and one of our leading religious historians. He says this: evangelicals will doubtless remain conservative in debates over moral questions and individualistic in their approach to social reconstruction. But it is also conceivable that they might reprise some of the genius for compromise that propelled William Wilberforce's parliamentary attack on slavery, the British politician who did most to end slavery in England, or some of the concern for marginalized that inspired the early labors of William Jennings Bryan, and some of the commitment to world peace that factored so large in the activities of Oregon Senator Mark Hatfield. For the future political considerations, it is important to remember that Wilberforce, Bryan, and Hatfield were every bit as evangelical as their fellow religionists who now join in vociferous campaigns against big government and enlist so eagerly in the NRA. Well, if I get a little too far off here and want to maybe nominate Mark Hatfield for sainthood, I'm sure my colleague Jane will bring us back to the center. Jane?
Hello all. Again, so lovely to see you all and to have you come to help us all think about Oregon. Let me get organized here.
Two more.
There we go. Yes, okay. And here are we. So my mission here is to talk about how the nation made Oregon. Certainly, Dick, I think, has given us some very interesting biographical figures who have brought Oregon and made changes and influenced in different ways the nation. But I'm here to tell you that the best way, perhaps, to understand Oregon is to understand it as a part of a significant national unit. We need to think about what the nation is saying and doing and how it is influencing the state in order to know what we think about it. I have another role here too, which is that I'm indulging myself. I'm bringing some work of my students to talk to you about. I have done a lot of my thinking about Oregon in classrooms at Lewis and Clark College, working with student researchers who have been hitting the archives, hitting the Oregon Historical Society, doing oral histories of all kinds, and they have produced some really innovative and important work that I am eager to share with you. I am going to be talking about 3 students' work. 2 of them are here tonight. And I'm hoping that as you listen to my very brief introductions to the kinds of things that they're thinking about, that you will ask them some questions at the end. To to start out here a little bit. Because some of the work that I'll be talking about has to do with race in Oregon, I thought I would start by talking a little bit about a topic that has been addressed often in recent weeks and months in Portland, the question about race and racism in Oregon, and where Oregon's whiteness comes from. I think that the Oregon Encyclopedia, in fact, tells us that in order to understand the nature of Oregon's homogeneous racial makeup, one place we have to look is to the Federal Donation Land Act of 1850, which significantly granted land only to every white settler. The discussion of the Oregon Constitution, also significant to understanding Portland and Oregon's racial makeup, taking place in 1857 to 59, the 50s, right before the Civil War. So when Oregon was thinking about making itself a state, very much at the center of everything it was thinking about was what it was going to do about race, and in particular the question of slavery. Some Oregonians favored slavery in Oregon. Some Oregonians opposed slavery in Oregon. Most Oregonians agreed that Oregon would be better if there were no African Americans at all in Oregon. This was reflecting, in fact, their Midwestern roots in many ways. The constitutional drafters brought with them documents from Iowa, from Michigan, and it, whoops, here we go. The constitutional document that they drafted indeed did ban new arrivals of Negroes and mulattoes from settling in Oregon. This was a national decision, a national creation, and it put Oregon on the map in a way it would not like to be left on the map, as the state that in its constitution has a ban on African American arrivals and settlers in Oregon. A little too quick. De Tocqueville, interesting on this, came to the United States in 1835 and said about race in various parts of the country that racial prejudice is stronger in the states where they have abolished slavery than where it still existed. And he's talking here about New England primarily. And nowhere is it stronger than in those states where servitude or slavery has never been known. And I think an interesting commentary on Oregon's history of race. I'm a little too quick on the draw here. Lovely illustration, I think, from the Oregon Encyclopedia, a photograph of the earliest African-American community, not the earliest, an early African-American community in Portland, which was located near the railroad station. African-Americans came in, blacks came in, working for the railroad, and stayed in hotels nearby. Of course, the Great Migration, and this is well known, of African Americans to Portland and to Oregon came during the Second World War, but it was part of a national movement, north and west, overwhelmingly north and west, 700,000 African Americans moving in those directions, often into unwelcoming communities, in the same way that Portland essentially was a very difficult place to arrive. 20,000 blacks joined an African-American community in 1940 that had 2,000 African-Americans, a huge, huge increase. Most came in 1943 when Henry Kaiser ran 2 trains into the South to bring workers from the South to his shipbuilding factories. This gives you a sense of, I'll get my little pointer here, if I can do it here, This is a general map which shows northern routes as part of the Second Great Migration. I think what's notable here is the enormous distance which blacks were traveling from the south to make their new homes in Portland, and leaving behind a lot and finding a very new world. This illustration suggests some of the welcome or the lack thereof of native Portlanders who did not indeed have any experience, any knowledge, or a very charitable approach to the African American arrivals. Now, to a particular individual, and I was struck as Dick was talking about the biographical theme that we've got going here. This is a particular individual who arrived in 1938, well before the Great Migration of the Second World War. His name was William McClendon, and he came from Georgia. He was a middle-class, educated young man, and he became one of the significant voices of the African American community in Portland as he founded and edited the African American newspaper, The Observer. So the work that I'll be talking about for a second here is work done by Stan Fonseca. And Stan, I'm going to ask you to stand up here so that Stan Fonseca is a senior graduating from Lewis and Clark. And do think of questions to ask him. He's been working on William McClendon for 3 years or so. He's written the Oregon Encyclopedia entry on McClendon. In fact, he was on the telephone tracking down a lead at one point, and the person on the other end didn't know his name and said, "Oh, you know, you really should take a look at that article in the Oregon Encyclopedia. There's a lot of great information in there." a lovely tribute. I think was this a family member? Anyway, somebody who knew McClendon. So, who was McClendon? He grew up in a house owned by his parents or his father. His father was a postman, middle class Atlanta background. Lived in the neighborhood where there were a number of colleges and universities, or African American colleges and universities. And when he was attending Morehouse, his great fortune was that W.E.B. Du Bois, the great Du Bois, was at Atlanta University working on a book. Exactly what their relationship is, Stan has not been able to figure out, but it's clear that there was a significant connection between this young man and this eminent, wise, guiding intellect. Another thing that Stan discovered in talking to McClendon's daughter, who lives in North Portland, Ida McClendon, was that he was the victim of a racist attack while distributing pamphlets in Atlanta, that he was nearly killed, and that he had to abandon the playing of, I believe it was the violin, and because he could no longer play after he was nearly killed in this attack. This, I think, changed his life in some significant ways. For one thing, it sent him north. He met a Spelman College student who happened to be from Portland. This was one of the big mysteries Stan and I were talking about. Why did William McClendon in 1938 take that long journey that you can see as you look at the map all the way to Portland? And the reason was that he had met a Portland girl, a young woman in Atlanta, and they came here to her home to marry and built a life here. Here, McClendon was persuaded by some friends of his that the African American community really needed a newspaper. He was educated. Not only did he have a bachelor's degree, he also had a master's degree from West Virginia. He was an obvious person to take on this job of providing news and inspiration to the African American community. Not long after McClendon arrived in Portland, in 1941, when the war broke out, it soon became clear that the African American community in Portland was going to be quite different than it had been before. McClendon allied himself with an African American intellectual campaign that took place in many newspapers around the country that was known as the Double V. The Double V for victory. Victory at home, victory abroad, victory against racism and fascism in Europe, victory against racism and violence in the United States. The idea, oops, let's go back here. The idea of the Double V was that if black workers loyally stepped up, did their very, very best for the American war effort, used the leverage of the need for labor to their best ability, then they could indeed expect some gratitude, some acknowledgement, and some progress, some change, some lasting change in their status, in their life. McClendon, in taking this position, was therefore allying himself with a patriotic message on the subject of the war. His wartime message and his expectation for the community that he joined was one that I think struck Stan and certainly struck me in reading about it as quite different from what we were expecting to read from an African American leader. He was very demanding of his fellow black community. He expected them to be disciplined. He expected them to follow the leadership of the NAACP and the other African American organizations, and he expected them not to indulge themselves by anger and frustration, but instead to work as part of a unit. He also was quite critical of African American the African American psyche. He believed that slavery and terror had fundamentally changed or damaged many African Americans, and that their ability to make good decisions was in some ways hurt by their lack of self-pride and the hurt that they had experienced from slavery. He brought a number of very interesting observations about the difference between Southern racism and Northern racism. He called Northern racism sophisticated racism, and said that it was equally insidious and equally problematic, but harder to see than what happened in the South. The war's end was devastating for William McClendon. He had wagered a lot on the Double V. He was expecting improvement. He was expecting change. And at the end of the war, he discovered that this one-sided compact, this investment by the African American community, had not been acknowledged or repaid by broader American society. So what did he do? Well, one thing that he did of great interest is he founded a jazz club, McClendon's Rhythm Room. He went back to an earlier love of music In fact, the McClendon's Rhythm Room was one of the leading jazz clubs throughout the 50s. You can ask Stan about that. In the 1960s, he was a social worker. He worked with people on an individual level, less group organizing, more individual organizing. And in the 1970s, late 60s and 70s, he was very active in the Black Studies movement, teaching both at Reed and at Portland State University, playing a significant role in launching the intellectual study of African Americans in this country. Stan has described this all as part of what an historian has described as the long civil rights movement. I think many of us are accustomed to thinking of the civil rights movement as something that happened in the 60s in the South. In fact, it started well before that. McClendon, through 60 years of activism, represented, Stan argues, that long civil rights movement. Throughout, William McClendon was engaged in important dialogue. He was printing in his newspaper articles from around the country, and he was reflecting ideas that had that came from elsewhere. A picture, an Oregon Encyclopedia picture from the 1960s of McClendon. Okay, so what should we make of this? What do we take from Stan's work? You can ask Stan himself. A couple of observations of mine. One of them is that in coming from the South and making that long journey across the United States up to Oregon, William McClendon kept Oregon looped in, kept Portland looped in, kept the African American community connected with the broader civil rights movement across a wide array of terrain. Also, however, William McClendon is somewhat unrecognized. I think that both of us, as we looked at the dynamism of his rhetoric, at his fiery writing, as his impassioned and incisive and clear-headed observations about race, we're wondering why more people didn't know who William McClendon was. The exciting part about that is that I think there are many such stories in Oregon, stories that are waiting to be told, and I'm quite thrilled with the way that Stan Fonseca has told the story of William McClendon. Okay, on to the next piece of fantastic student work, and I may cut this off a little bit because I very much want time for questions. A different migration, a global migration that preceded well the Second World War. The migration from Japan to the United States, the immigrant arrivals. 140,000 Japanese living in the United States in 1940, only 5,000 of them in Oregon, 5,000 of them often frequently working in agricultural work. Those who were born in Japan, as many of you may know, had been declared by the United States aliens ineligible for citizenship, given a special racial badge of ineligibility that in fact they did not even share with Africans. Africans, in following the Civil War, were granted access to naturalization in keeping with the momentary idealism of the Reconstruction period. Asians, no. Chinese initially and Japanese declared aliens ineligible for citizenship. FDR in 1942, ordering the internment of all Japanese living on in the west coast part of the United States. That included 2,500 residents of Multnomah County who were ordered to report to be interned in the former Pacific International Livestock Exposition in North Portland. So the Japanese American community initially lived within extremely dirty and unsavory circumstances. Okay, so this is story number 2. Emma ONeill. Emma, senior, history major, graduating shortly. So Emma's incredible piece of work, This Life Behind a Fence, the story of Kimmy Tambor, a journalist in an American concentration camp. We have reflected often on the fact that we have 2 journalists here, 2 journalists, young journalists writing during the Second World War, finding a voice, finding a cause, finding an identity in the context of a very challenging time. Kimmy Tambor was a Gresham High graduate, and she was kind of a star. Emma has done quite a lot of work in high school yearbooks and figuring out what was going on in Gresham. Tambor was on the forensics team. She won a competition in Linfield in speaking, and you see her here holding, get my right pointer here, holding the silver cup. She was also in plays in Gresham High School. There were apparently, from Emma's calculations, 6 different Nisei girls in her class, so they were very, very few Nisei, but none either. Other things about Tambor: she graduated in 1937 and she went off to college. Her parents were agricultural workers. They did not have much money. She went to Albany College for a semester in 1937. She dropped out, however, probably because her family needed her earnings. Her father was very elderly at this point, and her mother spoke no English. Kimmy Tambor was a very important support for the whole family. By 1941, she was already active in the Japanese American Citizens League, and again, she won an oratory contest giving a talk, "I Fought for America." Let's see if I can find one of the passage. This is one of the things that she said in her talk. "Born and reared in America, schooled in the American way of living, we cannot, must not accept this fate of being pushed back into the corners of the land. For this is our country, and we must make the rest of the people realize the fact that we belong to this country, and given a fighting chance, we can become valuable assets to the nation's welfare." This was very much Tambor's perspective, that if she was good enough, strong enough, hard enough working, she could prove her value. She could prove her right to dignity, to respect, and to opportunity. And she maintained this position even during internment. Tambor got something of a vocation in the internment camps. It seems clear that she was a beautician or worked in a hair salon after she left Albany College. That was her lifelong occupation. That is how she made money. When she was interned in the Assembly Center in Portland, she got a license or a certificate in cosmetology. But when she arrived in Minidoka, in internment camp, the newspaper needed help. And Kimmy Tambor had been a journalism major. She was going to major in journalism at Albany College. And that was enough of a credential in that context for her to get one of the better jobs in the camps, which was working for the newspaper. Later on, she became actually the editor-in-chief of the paper, as the early editors of the paper were experienced newspapermen from Seattle, Nisei. They, however, often left, found jobs elsewhere, and Kimmy Tambor ended up as the editor-in-chief. As the editor-in-chief, she was in a particularly interesting position because she was working for the War Relocation Authority. The folks who were running the newspaper or paying for the newspaper was the WRA, which ran the camps in the first place. And they had decided, and this was good strategizing on their part, that they needed a way of communicating to the Japanese Americans in the camp, and that it would be far better to have a Japanese American staff or a Nikkei staff producing the newspaper in the best American tradition, rather than simply issuing bulletins themselves. So Tambor was working with a series of WRA administrators to put out the paper. She understood the limits. She understood her position. She did a very fine job of representing the community to the best of her ability. She published when she needed to items that were given to her to publish. But she had one interesting sort of dust-up with one of the WRA authorities. And, in fact, it was clear that she was quite a spirited and peppery, I think was the term that Emma described as, a peppery person. And she and two of her fellow female reporters were known as the unholy triumvirate around the camps because of their lively and spirited way of doing business. Her dust-up with the WRA superior to her, Mr. Graham, had to do with trust. Tambor considered herself a professional. She was a professional. She had high standards. She could be relied on. She had honesty and integrity. At one point, though, Mr. Graham asked her to please not publish a picture in the paper. And she said, okay, I understand that this is the limits. We won't publish that picture. However, after that, he searched the car as the paper was going to press to see whether the picture was in there. And she was deeply, deeply offended. In fact, one could argue that perhaps this was something of a tipping point. She realized that no matter how good she was, how responsible, how professional, she could not earn her way into a position of full participation in American society. Thereafter, she was more likely to claim rights as her due, rather than to take this position that if she was simply good enough, perfect enough, she would achieve that status. After internment, Kimmy Tambor came back with her family to Portland, not to Gresham, but they lived in Japantown. She and they bought a hotel, which they ran as a way of making money. Tambor at this point was 26, the age that you might imagine a young woman, young Japanese American woman would be marrying. She had a family to take care of, though. Her father at this point was not very effective. Her mother needed help, and she became that daughter who took care of that family. She resumed her activity in the Japanese American Citizens League, and in fact became president of the JACL in 1958. And she also sought a newspaper opportunity. She became the English language editor of the Asu Nippo, I'm sure I'm butchering that, the Oregon Weekly, a paper that was first published in Japanese in 1906 and that was published after the loss of the printing press that was confiscated during the war on mimeograph machines following the war. Kimmy Tambor also became very active in the redress movement. This was the movement to ask the United States government for appropriate compensation for the loss and the unjust incarceration that the Japanese citizens and non-citizens were exposed to. She unfortunately did not live to see the redress movement bear fruit. She died about 6 years before that happened. But I think that her story is an interesting one on this question about what is unique about Oregon. One of the things that does occur to me is that in her experience in a small community of Japanese Americans, or small Japanese settlement in Gresham, her experience was probably quite different than growing up in Japantown and Los Angeles or in some of the other cities. And certainly I'm impressed by her tenacity and her spunk. One historian of Japanese American women, Mai Nakano, has said that Nisei daughters were expected to be appropriate, to be self-sacrificing, to be docile, to put the needs of the family and to put the needs of others first. Nakano said, "This is not the stuff of which heroines are made." I think that Emma here may not have a heroine. She realizes that it's not necessarily historically highly appropriate to claim heroine status for historical figures who are fully mortal and have very complex identities. But nonetheless, I think that Kimmy Tambor is a somewhat unusual and a very worthy entry into the pantheon of internment voices. This is a voice that has not been heard before. It's a voice that we have the Nikkei Legacy Center to thank for. They collected the papers, but we also have Emma to thank for this story, which she has assembled in a very beautiful way. I actually do have one more example, but I would prefer to use the time that we have left, I think, to allow you all to ask questions perhaps about these two individuals, two biographical figures that I'm adding to Dick's as we think about biography. And I would love to allow you to ask the authors here, Emma ONeill or Stan Fonseca. So I think maybe I'll stop there. I like the idea of stopping a series on Oregon history by passing the torch to another generation, a younger generation, who has the questions, the important questions today to bring to the story of Oregon. We were certainly largely a silver-haired crew. I'm very thrilled to have some young students who themselves see the importance and the significance of Oregon history. So thanks, and I think I'll stop there.